And welcome to our Accessibility Best Practice webinar, which we are hosting in honour of Accessibility Awareness Day, which is tomorrow. We're very passionate about accessibility at Torchbox all the year, not just for a special day. We're passionate about it for our clients and for our open source content management system called Wagtail. And there are still way too many digital experiences that still exclude people with challenges like limited vision and hearing and mobility and cognitive ability issues. So by prioritising digital accessibility, you can make your reach even wider and enhance the experience for all of your users. But today, we're not just going to look at accessibility against project timelines or checkpoints. We want to look at accessibility as a continuous practice that you can embed throughout your user research and design and content strategy and development phases and beyond for all of your projects. If you're new to our webinars, I'm Lisa and I'm Head of Marketing at Torchbox and I'm your host for today. I'm a mixed race woman, half Bengali and half English, and I'm wearing a snazzy green and white pattern shirt. And I'm joined by some fabulous speakers who will share their practical advice and experiences so that you'll leave motivated, hopefully with lots of new ideas to champion accessibility in your organisation. So I am delighted to be joined by Quarina Sultana, who is Head of Engagement at RNIB. She's going to shed light on critical accessibility considerations and the impressive strides that they've made for their service users. Jonny Peacock, Senior Service Designer, is going to reveal insights from real-world testing and the essential role of user-friendly research tools. We have Jane Hughes, Senior Developer and Accessibility Expert. She's going to discuss the synergy between user research and UX design using an agile approach. And we have Ben Tuckwell, Senior Interaction Designer, who's going to share his expertise in designing enhanced user experiences. Today, I ask you to please use the Q&A for all of your questions because it helps me to keep track, but also we want to be mindful for anyone that is using a screen reader and wants to mute the chat. So if we can limit that and have the Q&A for all the questions, that will be fantastic. And I am recording the session as well. And so I'll send you the recording in a follow-up email along with any useful links to the resources and tools that we referenced during the session today. And that's it from me. So I am going to hand over to Quarina.
Hi, everybody. So as Lisa said, I'm Quarina Sultana. I'm Head of Digital Engagement at RNIB. That's the Royal National Institute of the Blind, not the boats, not the lifeboats, not the anything else. Although we do get quite a lot on our social media just talking about boats. So I'm Bengali, British Bengali. I've got dark hair, brown skin. I'm wearing a dusky pink top today. And as Lisa said, accessibility isn't just a checkbox or a checkpoint to tick off. It is a fundamental aspect of creating a really inclusive online environment that embraces diversity and empowers all the users to really engage fully with all of our digital offerings. In our fast-paced digital world, it's really easy to overlook the needs of those with disabilities, but by neglecting accessibility, we're not only excluding a significant portion of our audience, but really missing out on valuable opportunities for innovation and for growth. Think about it. By making our digital content and the platforms accessible, we're not only serving the needs of people with those disabilities, but also enhancing the experience for everybody. Studies have shown that companies that prioritize accessibility tend to outperform their competitors. And by ensuring that digital platforms are accessible to all, we're tapping into really vast and often overlooked market segment. So being RNIB and being what we do, accessibility is the forefront of our mission. We're the UK's leading cyclist charity, for those that might not know, and we aimed and are dedicated to breaking down barriers and ensuring that blind and partially sighted individuals have equal access to information, services, and opportunities. So in addition to our commitment to accessibility, we do provide valuable business offerings to help you make your businesses more accessible and or for any consultation. So our kind of partnership with Torchbox came when we were looking to redevelop our website. And when we were looking at doing so, we had a couple of core requirements that we knew that we wanted to get right, and we knew that had to be part of this. We knew we wanted accessibility to be at the forefront, from both the front and the back end. Within our team, so within my team, there's 3 team members with Cyclos who edit and upload content within our CMS on a regular basis, and approximately 7 that navigate across our digital platforms as a whole regularly, if not daily. That meant that an additional challenge of not only did our front end have to be accessible, but the content management system and the back ends also did too. And that's a challenge that not a lot of companies often they overlook it. And for us, it was a core requirement. It was a must-have, not necessarily a need-to-have. We knew that we also didn't want to compromise on design, and we knew that prioritizing accessibility doesn't have to mean bad or bland design. So we wanted it to be a showcase for usability and accessibility. And this is kind of where I add the terms accessibility, usability are often used interchangeably, but they actually refer to distinct aspects of a website's design and functionality. Accessibility is the technical side of a website, ensuring they can be used by people with disabilities or people with assistive tech in this particular kind of focus. On the other hand, usability refers to the quality of a person's use and experience when interacting with websites and platforms, including the efficiency in which they can complete tasks and their overall satisfaction with the process. And I think overall, that's why we liked Torchbox, because not only did they understand the differences between accessibility and usability being key, but the CMS that Lisa mentioned very briefly, Wagtail, was really accessible, and more importantly, could be really developed and optimized for blind and partially sighted people, or for the needs that we had. And I must say, admittedly, we gave them a really hard time throughout the project, because every single communication, that be emails, design, prototypes, user research, wireframes, everything had to be in an accessible format. And they did pretty great. So to kind of start us off, I'm going to hand over to Jonny, who's going to be talking about integrating accessibility into our user research.
Thanks, Quarina. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonny. I'm a senior service designer at Torchbox. Little about me, I'm a man with white skin. I have brown hair. Today I'm wearing a navy Torchbox shirt, which is very on brand of me, and I have some big black headphones on. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about, as Quarina mentioned, some of the user research side of things that we did and the overall kind of process that we took. So let me just share my slides and check that those are coming through for everybody. Lisa, can you confirm that those are showing up?
Yep, all good.
Great. Okay. So if you're here, you're probably already interested in accessibility and have a sense of its importance. But before we dive in to some of the other details, I wanted to give a quick recap of some of the reasons that you should care about accessibility in the first place. So let's look at some numbers. First of all, it has a really big impact on business. So from a monetary standpoint, it's really impactful to your organization. It was estimated that accessibility issues cause online retailers to miss out on almost $7 billion a year, which is obviously a massive thing to miss out on. It's a common thing that can be a problem as well for organizations. It's estimated that 70% of websites have critical blockers for users with accessibility needs. And it's not a niche thing either for your audiences. It affects a lot of people. 81% of disabled adults in the UK are people who also use the internet. And that 81% adds up to about 11 million people, and that is rising every year. Secondly, it's not just people with disabilities that can benefit from features that make sites more accessible. So this diagram, which is made by Microsoft, illustrates a really important point that many impairments are temporary or situational. And ultimately, we all face impairments of some kind like this during our lives. If you've ever used captions on a video in a noisy or a very quiet space, then you've benefited from accessibility features, whether or not you consider yourself to have a disability. And in this session, we're going to mostly focus on sight impairments, but it's worth remembering that accessibility doesn't just stop at vision. And then thirdly, there are guidelines, which you're probably already aware of, that many organizations and sometimes laws and governments expect to be followed around accessibility. So for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is abbreviated to WCAG or sometimes called WCAG, is a standard that outlines how teams can make things, digital things, in an accessible way. And the standard has different levels of conformance, so you can hit A, AA, or AAA, and it aims to ensure that systems have four main qualities. They need to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. I'm not going to go into all the details of those today in this session. There's lots of good resources out there, but it's good to know that there are, in different countries, there are different laws about accessibility of digital systems and what's required. But many will require a certain level of conformance with WCAG or similar principles, and that's especially true for public service websites. And the other reason for bringing this up is that WCAG conformance is often seen as enough when it comes to accessibility by a lot of organizations. However, there's only so much that generic guidelines in a standard can do to predict the specific issues that are going to be relevant to your individual websites. And that's where user research comes in. So to find out how best to make things accessible for your users, you'll need to do user research. And that means making sure that your methods are accessible for your participants as well. And I just want to share a few things that we learned about that from working on the RNIB website. So in our experience, there are a few research methods in particular that run into some big accessibility problems for participants with visual impairments, particularly when they're done unmoderated, which means that the researcher themselves is not present to kind of help them through. I'm sure you probably all heard of these, but surveys, they're obviously very widespread. They're very useful to help reach quite broad audiences. In a user research context, they're helpful to help you know what questions to ask before you do interviews, or perhaps to see how well your findings from those interviews scale to a broader set of people. Card sorts, that's a method that can help us understand people's mental models and associations, which helps us organize content on digital platforms. And tree testing is another technique that's used to evaluate a proposed navigation structure in the abstract. So not in the context of a user interface, but just the hierarchy itself. And all of these can run into some problems when it comes to trying to do research for people with visual impairments. So the first one is spatial user interfaces. Card sorting in particular is very guilty of using a very spatial metaphor for their UIs. And this usually means that participants have to use drag and drop interactions to move items from one bucket into another. And they rely on people being able to organize things positionally, which is obviously quite difficult if you can't see what's actually being displayed on the screen. And probably more importantly, all of these tools tend to use a lot of extra code to make them work, and they either ignore or kind of overwrite somehow the standard coding structures like semantic HTML that help screen readers to interpret and describe the pages for people who can't see the screen itself. And what that means is that those pages end up being very frustrating to use at best and unusable at worst. And all of these techniques and the online tools that we, as an industry, use for them, they often have lots of information and options on the screen at once, which means there's lots of extra detail to keep track of. And that doesn't help the cognitive load that users have to bear while they're going through it. It means it's more likely that they'll struggle. So to address these issues on the RNIB project, we ended up ditching a lot of the usual tools, and instead we ran closed card sorts and tree tests using surveys that we'd adapted to be as accessible as possible. So we did that initially with a moderator alongside the participants to help guide them through that process and step in if they were struggling. And that allowed us to identify any further ways to make the survey easier to use before we sent it out to a broader set of people to complete unmoderated. And we also included segmentation questions at the start of those surveys to check that all the kinds of people that we needed to hear from were actually able to complete the form. Yeah, there we go. I also wanted to share a few things that we did a bit differently in our approach to this project to help put accessibility right at the forefront. So when designing for sight loss, there are two broad categories of condition that we had to design for. Typically, screen reader users are entirely reliant on the way that the user interface is coded and not how it's presented. So we wanted to make sure that the code worked as well for them as possible. But we also wanted to create a great experience for people who could see the visual part of the interface and wanted to use it, but had a visual impairment that made this harder, and we call those low vision users. And since the code and the visuals would be very interdependent, our question was, where do we start? We had a bit of a chicken and egg situation. And in the end, we found an approach that allows us to work on the two in parallel and then bring them both together at the end, while also allowing us to get actionable insight from the usability testing throughout the process. So this is what it looked like. Normally, code would only really be written once we knew what the user interface would look like to at least a certain degree. But because we had existing code to draw from in an unbranded design system, which we'll talk more about later, and we had some example content that we could use to structure some pages, we actually started coding the front end very early on. And this meant that we could run usability testing with screen reader users right from the very start. And that helped us to check that the code that we were writing was working well with screen reader software, while we were working on the visual design of the site and the navigation separately. And so once that was progressed sufficiently, we could then start doing usability testing with low vision users on our early visual concepts for how the site would look and work. And this led to a lot of early insights that were really invaluable to our process and meant that we had time left in the project to adapt and incorporate what we'd learned. And with that feedback ready, we could then apply the visuals to the code that we'd started writing on a staging site, which meant that we could test with users of all types of visual impairments, as well as other audiences like friends and family members, all using the same prototype. And because of the earlier testing we'd already done separately, this was more about refining the details and helped to prevent any nasty surprises at the end of the process. So just to recap, ultimately, the main benefits of following this approach were that we built on existing work to avoid reinventing the wheel, and the design system was really critical to that. We were able to learn fast directly from users, not just following best practices and hoping that would be enough. And we had the time to adjust course as necessary. The development and the design were able to feed into each other's work, as the two needed to work hand in hand in order to achieve good accessibility for users. And we were able to optimize for usability as well as conformance to the usual standards, as Quarina mentioned earlier. That's all I want to say with that. I'm going to pass to Ben, who's going to talk a bit more about accessibility in the design side of things.
Great, thanks, Jonny. Hi, I'm Ben. I'm a white male. I'm wearing a black top and glasses. I'm an interaction designer at Torchbox. I worked on the redesign of the RNIB website a couple of years ago, and I'll be giving a brief overview of our design process. So the first section I'll be speaking about is initial research activities. So one of the first things we do to review any research our team has undertaken. This is primarily to get a better understanding of our audience, their needs and their pain points. Sometimes there may be some specific user research insights that relate to visual design. One example of this with RNIB was that some people found the combination of white text on large areas of RNIB's signature brand pink color hard to read. Insights like these can give us some initial steer on how to work with brand assets in the new designs. Another activity at the start of the design phase is to review websites from organizations that offer similar services. Regarding the RNIB project, I wanted to see how similar organizations approach designs for users with low vision. We looked at color schemes, different viewing modes, and design patterns that these sites used. Jane, our front-end developer, also provided some guidance of best practice component design based on our own research as well. There's a range of guidance available to help with making designs more accessible and usable. The main ones we referred to were the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, as Jonny mentioned, and the accessibility requirements for people with low vision guidance. But there's also a range of other guidance available online for designing with people with specific impairments. A significant part of our interaction design work is balancing the effective use of brand assets with accessibility and usability. It was important to RNIB that we provided a highly accessible and usable site that also had a visually rich design. So to better understand the brand side of things, I spoke with RNIB's brand team. They had done a lot of work developing the brand identity over the years, so I wanted to make sure that I learned from them and that they were able to be involved in the website design process. In general, on any project we work on, it's essential that we're collaborating with our clients throughout the whole process. I onboarded myself onto the organization's brand and brand assets by reviewing their guidelines. Our focus here was to get a good understanding of the brand, but also review the accessibility of the brand identity's assets to see if we could suggest any updates. We review the brand colors and the way they're being used against WCAG accessibility standards. If the color combinations fail accessibility standards, we'll suggest alternative combinations or different color values completely. If we do this, we're always mindful to try and keep things on brand as much as possible. It's not uncommon for brands to have slightly different print and digital color palettes to accommodate accessibility, and it's those digital color palettes that we often help to develop. Even if color combinations do pass accessibility standards, there's still more to consider. We'll always aim to use color in ways that will enhance usability and go beyond the accessibility standards. We also review the accessibility of brand typefaces. In general, simpler typefaces would be preferable as they're more readable. Typefaces with larger open spaces within and around characters, often called counters, help improve legibility. I've visualized this on the current slide. We also want typefaces that have clearly recognizable characters. For example, sometimes typefaces won't have clear visual distinction between the number 1, an uppercase letter I, and a lowercase letter L. I've also visualized a good example of this on the current slide. There are, of course, many other branding and accessibility considerations when picking typefaces. We try to avoid decorative typefaces. These could require more effort from the audience to read them. We've worked with organizations who have had decorative typefaces as key brand assets. In those cases, we've suggested that they use them sparingly and just on larger headings as a compromise between branding and usability. We also tried to get feedback during usability testing on decorative typefaces to see if and how they impact usability. We'll often do a review of the current website design and other branded materials as well. There may be specific brand motifs that a client wants to continue using, so there's brand consistency across different audience touchpoints, but we need to consider if any of those motifs have accessibility or usability issues. This could be things like patterns, complex graphics, or heavy use of motion or video. But even if you're not totally redesigning your site, there's often a lot of smaller changes that can be made to improve accessibility and usability. For example, you can adjust things like color contrast levels, text sizes, spacing, typefaces used, widths of text columns, layout, spacing between elements, and many other things. These adjustments would benefit everyone who uses the site, not just people with specific impairments or disabilities. As I mentioned, RNIB's brand identity was well established, but we often work with clients who are in the process of refreshing their brand identity. For example, we recently worked with Sue Ryder to redesign their site, and we were able to review the work-in-progress brand assets at a much earlier stage. Because of this, we were able to offer feedback on how to make them more accessible for digital use before the brand identity was finalized. So on to design strategy. After we've reviewed the foundational elements of the brand identity, we start to think about how we'll use them in the new website design. We start mapping brand colors to key areas of the user interface, for example, text colors, colors used for interactive elements like buttons, background colors, border colors, and so on. We make sure any color combinations we're creating have sufficient amounts of color contrast to pass WCAG AA standards, and we're sometimes able to exceed AA and hit AAA. We also consider the different view modes we might want to offer to the audience and create accessible color schemes for those modes. For RNIB, we expanded the core color palette with a dark mode palette. Then after the site had launched, a yellow mode was added, as many RNIB audiences found that to be a helpful mode to view the site in. We assign a typographic scale to the design. A typographic scale is a range of text sizes that will be used in different ways across the design. This improves usability because the text sizes applied to headings add structure to the design and make it easier for people to scan pages. This typographic scale is then used across the entire site, creating consistency and familiarity in the layout for RNIB's audience, which again helps to improve usability. As we're making these design decisions, we're developing a design system. This allows us to maintain accessibility across components, pages, and various flows. It creates a single source of truth that the Torchbox and client teams can refer to, and it also ensures a smooth handoff to the development team so the site can be built accurately. So finally, design development. As mentioned, we based a lot of our components and pattern on the gov.uk digital design system. This gave us a solid foundation of accessibility and usability to work from. But there were many components we needed to design that were not part of the gov design system. In those cases, I aim to design them in an accessible way. I referenced the research we'd gathered previously, referred back to accessibility guidelines, as I mentioned. I also explored design patterns from other established design systems, such as the NHS design system. As we started to produce template designs, we could see the foundational elements working together. This was another chance for us to sense check our decisions and to be mindful of accessibility guidance. We'd have regular design reviews with Jane and the RNIB team, including their accessibility experts. I was very aware during the design phase that there was still a lot I didn't know about our audience and their specific eye conditions. And there were parts of the design that I thought could be problematic for some users with low vision. So it's important to test the visual designs as soon as possible, and that way I could take what I'd learned and apply it to the next round of design work immediately. So as I was creating the designs, I kept a list of things I wanted to try to get feedback on. Jonny and I tried to find ways to address this in the usability testing plans. I then attended the usability testing sessions. I made notes on things I observed, noted down ideas for possible solutions at the time. Then Jonny and I would debrief to share what we'd observed. Then with the client's input, we agreed on a course of action for changes. It was incredibly valuable to be part of usability testing. With every round of testing, I could learn more about RNIB's audience, their needs and their pain points, build greater empathy towards RNIB's audience in general, learn more about how they interacted with the site and what technology they used, iterate and improve on designs to better address their needs. And finally, we could go beyond just ticking accessibility boxes and focus on greater levels of usability. I'll now pass over to Jane, who will talk about the development of the RNIB project.
Cool, thank you, Ben. Hi everyone, I'm Jane. I'm a senior front-end developer and accessibility specialist at Torchbox. I have white skin, dark blonde hair. I'm also wearing glasses, and today I'm wearing a cream t-shirt, which is also Torchbox branded. And I'm going to be talking about developing accessible services, particularly in relation to our work with RNIB, but also the various lessons that we learned along the way. So one of my most important takeaways from all of our accessibility research, and especially our collaboration with clients like RNIB, is just how important it is to take a human-centered approach if you want to build a truly inclusive service. Listening to users' own experiences and taking those insights on board really builds not only empathy for the end user, but also a deeper understanding of why it's so beneficial to go beyond the standard technical best practices that we hear and read so much about. So I'm just showing a quote on the screen now, which I will read out for you. It says, "I use VoiceOver, but I am a reluctant VoiceOver user. I get frustrated because I learned by researching myself how to navigate using VoiceOver." And this quote really stood out to me from our user testing for RNIB, as it really highlights how some users are very reluctantly using assistive technology and would actually rather completely avoid it if they could. So while testing for assistive technology is really important, this quote, I think, raises a really great question. Is there more that we could be doing to actually reduce people's reliance on these tools entirely and improve their user experience as a result? Technical guidelines like WCAG help to establish a solid foundation, but to address the needs of your specific users and audience, there really is no substitute for speaking with them directly. So when it comes to testing, I think these three things are key to bear in mind. Be open-minded, expect the unexpected, and make sure that you take an agile approach so that you are ready and prepared to change direction as needed based on the feedback that you receive. Now, as I mentioned, when developing an accessible service, it's really helpful to establish that solid foundation at the very beginning. As Ben highlighted, using a design system is a really great way of doing this, as you can build on it easily using feedback from that user testing. Now, it's great to establish a design system at the beginning of a site build if you can, but if you don't have one, it can be created at any point. And we've supported many of our clients with this, including Buckinghamshire Council and more recently with Sue Ryder. And we find that it just really helps to maintain really solid accessibility standards as well as quality and brand consistency. And this is especially important when you have multiple developers or designers or other team members onboarding to a project over time. Having a toolbox like this to refer to is incredibly helpful for maintaining that consistency. It can be helpful to start by reviewing existing brand work and consolidating and testing any reusable components that you already have, and using this for the basis of your design system. Now, you might also have heard of the term shift left when it comes to testing, and this is really crucial, especially for accessibility, as these issues are often much easier and cheaper to fix the earlier that they are found. And essentially, shift left testing means testing early and testing often, and this should be included at every stage of a project from requirement gathering onwards. And I'm just showing a visual representation of the cost to fixed issues increasing over time if that testing is not included earlier on in the process. So it's something that you need to ideally start thinking about from the very beginning, even as you're planning a new project. And we take this approach for testing for all of our work, including our collaboration with RNIB. To help with this, we built some basic prototypes to test the page markup with core components. And as Jonny already discussed, this allowed us to see if our proposed page layouts would allow screen reader users particularly to find the content that they wanted quickly, and also meant that we could compare these results with the existing site and how users were finding that, and make sure that we were making positive improvements. We've successfully run prototype user testing for a number of clients, including the Mozilla Foundation and Mind, as we continually find it a great way to gather insights and adapt our approach very quickly from the beginning. Before we committed colors and styling to code, we also tested initial Figma prototypes with low vision users, and as Ben mentioned, from this, we discovered that many people really valued having a dark mode alternative. Some users even expressed how much dark modes reduced their reliance on accessibility software completely. And as I mentioned before, the more that we can reduce people's reliance on these tools, the better. It was this learning from early tests that meant that we were able to prioritize building in a dark theme from the outset. And it's just something that we would not have prioritized without this open communication from users. So it's really easy to make assumptions about what could be improved for your users. For RNIB, initially, we felt imagery might become a secondary priority, as we assumed that images may be less important for blind and low vision users. But when it came to testing, we quickly learned that the opposite was true, and supporting images was still very valuable for everybody. And a really great example of this was on an event page in one of our Figma prototypes, which used this supporting image. And I'm just showing this on the slide now. It depicts a visually impaired person and their running guide in a marathon. And it turned out this was a really valuable asset for low vision users. One person even said that it was great to have this visual representation of opportunities for them, like marathon running, which they wouldn't have been able to appreciate with the written content on the page alone. So from a technical perspective, we utilized the GovUK design system to build most of our core components right at the start, as we knew that this was thoroughly tested for accessibility and usability. And it meant that we were able to get started by building a basic foundation of page templates really quickly for those prototypes. So we didn't have to wait for designs to be finished, we could get testing straight away. Because these components are so well tested, I had assumed that we wouldn't necessarily need to change them that much beyond adapting the styling for the RNIB brand. However, after collaborating with RNIB's in-house accessibility team and testing with users, it became clear that the default focus styles for some form elements may not be sufficient for some low vision users. So we decided to refine these even further to enhance the experience for this audience. And I'm just showing images on the screen now, which show a before and after of the styling updates we made to the GDS checkbox component specifically. And what we did here was increase the border width and change the color slightly to increase that contrast even further for the low vision users. So all of these things meant that we were continuously adapting our approach, which was really important to make sure that we were building the right things in the right ways. And also, and maybe even more importantly, how to test and iterate on our work more effectively in the process. Ultimately, accessibility is an ongoing commitment, and it's very much a balancing act. You're never going to get things absolutely perfect for everybody. But adding in flexibility for users, such as different theming options like dark mode, and other incremental changes over time will make a huge difference to so many people. And focusing on your own user audience is an excellent way to help prioritize the most impactful changes that you can make right now, but also moving forwards. And if you're interested in reading a little bit more about our work with RNIB, I wrote a blog post covering some of my other highlights, which we will share a link for later. And I'm now going to hand back to Quarina, who's going to talk a little bit about insights and impact.
Thank you, Jane. So yeah, I'm going to just kind of touch on insights and impact, and then a little bit about content accessibility as a whole. So just to go back to kind of learnings from, particularly from the prototype testing, I've kind of put our key findings on here on our slide, which I'll read through. So we quickly discovered that dark mode was the most popular request and made the biggest difference to blind and partially sighted users across the site. Approximately 70% of our users currently still use dark mode. That's a huge number. As Jane said, images can be still useful. In one test, a user responded really positively upon reading the image description to the running. And I think it's that the fact that they weren't aware that this is possible, and it really brought the idea to life in the way that the text on the page did not or could not. Bold color inversions can be tiring or jarring. So often what pages differentiate between sections of content by introducing a new contrasting background color. But when this contrast was too strong, we found that users found this really strain their eyes, depending on their eye condition. When it comes to zooming or zoomability, if that's a word, the tools and settings that people use for accessibility are really diverse. And that means that each person will use their assistive tech slightly differently. One thing that is a strength of the web and is standard HTML, CSS, whatever you want to say, is that people can resize text dynamically. This adds really much more importance to having a responsive design and implementation, as well as resizing based on window size. It's really kind of important, I think, to consider and test how the site responds to dynamically larger text, rather than just making the design larger. What if it was just the text, or what if it was just the image? And kind of really, I guess, scrutinizing these questions. Apply buttons. So the principle of updating only in response to buttons kind of led to confusion when people were using filters. People didn't expect to need to click apply filters, or even need to look for such a button. And in one of our tests, we found that 30% of the people 30% of people applied the filters way more if there wasn't a button involved. So when it comes to a navigation menu, I think the thing to keep in mind is, on a screen reader, navigation menu reads like a telephone menu. So the experience of following a navigation menu on the links list of links for a screen reader is really they have to remember the options that have been read out to them and in what order that they came. That's just another reason to keep the options really simple and keep your list as short as possible, and your navigation as simple as possible. All this to say, you don't really need fancy techniques. You just need to listen to people, which has been kind of iterated all throughout the slide. Watch them use something. I think you learn a lot by just watching people's behavior, as creepy as that one sounds. And there'll be most likely things you can't really read in a specification. So this is a quote that we had from a user before the redesign, and it really highlights the kind of user need. So the quote says, when we were thinking about it, so we think we knew how to talk about it being the eye condition as a medical problem and something that she needed care for, but we didn't know how to talk about the ways in which it impacted her daily life. So that's a parent of a child with sight loss talking about it. And I think that really highlights how we needed to have user needs as a focus. So for blind and partially sighted people, this is one of our key user need, which is really friends and family wanting to understand the experience of their family members, their friends, to really empathize and anticipate their needs. And that really comes back to this idea of human-centered design. You know, what are your user needs? What are they wanting to do? Just to go through the other three that were also really high for us is opportunities to engage in the cause or get involved in the VI community, information on financial support, educational support, or emotional support, and information and technology, and particularly resources for practical day-to-day tasks. But creating accessible content isn't just about catching the eye, it's about ensuring everybody, regardless of ability, can engage with it. We've spoken about key principles in WCAG, but in a practical sense, what does this actually mean? So let's dive into key considerations for content accessibility, because it's absolutely crucial, particularly online. So first up, clear, consistent formatting. Most readers on the web tend to scan the content rather than reading every single word. So breaking up your content into easily digestible chunks with proper headings and subheadings can really help. But it's not about just making it look nice and about people scanning. It's about helping people find what they need really quickly. For those with screen readers, headings and subheadings are a godsend. They provide a clear structure and context, making navigation a breeze. And it's important to say that the order that you have your headings and subheadings, that's the order that it will read out on that screen reader. Using bullet points and numbered lists is another great trick. It enhances readability by breaking down information into bite-sized pieces. So when you're organizing your content, make sure to use the right heading tags. Like I said, like H1 for main tags, H2 for subheadings, H3 for minor points. Again, it's not just the visual, it makes a difference for screen readers who rely on tags who understand hierarchy and structure of the content. Next up, alt text. You've all heard it, I'm sure, but always use descriptive alternative text for your images. It's really essential for users with sight loss, and it allows screen readers to convey the content of the images. Think of it as a brief description that captures the essence of what the image is about. It's a really small detail, can make a huge difference in accessibility. And I think sometimes there's this debate about what about decorative text, decorative images? Does it really matter? What should we do? And I think the thing to keep in mind is, if you were completely unable to see this page, would describing this image that you've marked as decorative be helpful to give context and provide the essence of what you're trying to convey? You don't want to overdo it, but I think that's the question to determine whether it's right for you or not. So now let's talk about links. When you include links in your content, make sure the link is clear and descriptive. That means avoiding vague phrases like click here, and instead using text that clearly tells the user exactly what they can expect if they follow the link. For example, read Jane's latest blog on accessibility tips is much more informative than just read here. This practice is particularly beneficial for people using, again, with screen readers, and it gives them a better understanding of the link's purpose. For videos, always include accurate descriptions or captions and makes your content really accessible to people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And it's about ensuring everybody can access and understand your videos. Captions captions should be synchronized with the audio and reflect what is being said as accurately as possible. And if you do have the resources, provide full transcriptions, which is really, really helpful. Lastly, let's not forget downloadable documents. So whether it's PDFs, Word files, or any other format, they need to be clearly formatted or tagged. This way, the screen readers can really interpret the content effectively. Additionally, consider offering alternative formats like audio recordings, accessible PDFs to cater to different user preferences. Making sure that your documents are accessible is not just is just as important as your online content. And I think by applying these principles of accessibility, you can really create a much more inclusive campaign, reaching and engaging a much more broader audience. Again, it's about making sure that everybody, regardless of their abilities, can access and enjoy your content. And you might think that that's all great, but will it really have an impact? Well, that's so again, this is a quote that I would like to end on, so I'll read this last. But if we take a closer look at our numbers, so first off, our sessions since our website launch has shot up by, and these are crazy numbers, so trigger warning there, has shot up by an astonishing 272% year on year. That's not just a little bump, that's a significant leap. Imagine having 3 times the number of people engaging with your content compared to last year. Again, it's a massive increase, and it really clearly shows that there's a growing interest and interaction. If we delve deeper, that's an engagement rate that has a remarkable rise of 276%. Again, it's about more people showing up. It's not just about people showing up, it's about people getting involved, spending more time and interacting more with our content. Such a substantial boost in engagement is just a strong indicator that our content is not just only attracting more people, but it's resonating with them. And if that's not impressive enough, and consider this, our audio usage has skyrocketed by an unbelievable 12,814.3%. That's right, that is the correct number, that is not made up. It's a staggering figure that points to a massive surge in how people are consuming our Connect radio content, and a clear sign that audio is becoming an increasingly popular medium for content consumption. Looking at these figures, it's pretty clear that the impact is real and substantial, and the growth across sessions, engagement, and audio highlights a significant shift and expansion in how audiences are really interacting with content. Again, it's not a fleeting trend. Accessibility is never just a trend, but these numbers really suggest a deepening and widening engagement that's likely to have a really lasting impact. So when it comes to kind of some feedback, which is what I think I'd like to end on, so we had kind of 3 quotes, 2 which are not on screen, just for keeping the slides as minimal as possible. So the first user said, I really like how I have various options so I can decide how I can use the site. So that's referring to the different modes we have, so dark mode, light mode, and yellow mode. And there's another user said, thank God it doesn't revert the pictures automatically on dark mode. So that came from often on certain websites, when you invert the page or use dark mode, it automatically inverts the images as well. And lastly, this quote where it says, on the screen where it says, so refreshing to be able to use a website where I don't feel like a burden for my needs. It's all seamless and I can intuitively do things and it just works. No more chaos. So I think I'll end on that and pass back to Lisa.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. We have got a lovely load of questions. Jonny, if you can stop sharing now, that'd be great. Thank you very much. So thank you everybody for using the Q&A and submitting your questions. The first couple are talking about testing prototypes and HTML versus Figma. So it'll probably be Jane or Ben for these. So the first one from Susanna, I'm assuming it increases cost a fair bit to test and iterate HTML prototypes as opposed to just using Figma. Any response to that?
Yes, I think, but it's important, I think, based on what we were talking about incorporating these things in your plan from the very beginning. So as long as you're making sure that you're balancing your testing, I think, with both. I don't actually think it massively changed our timeline doing them. We did them in tandem, so we were able to test HTML and designs together. So it wasn't like we were adding extra time onto the project. It was very much done and planned in straight away. So while it could, if it's not planned in well enough and you're sort of appending it to some existing testing, I think making sure that you're planning that in would be the best approach.
And to that point, someone else also asked, Andrea asked, have you run testing with users who use assistive technology using Figma prototypes, or do you always have to develop them using unstyled HTML to do testing?
No. So that was part of the reason for doing the different kinds of prototype. So we wanted to make sure that we had actual HTML prototypes that we could share with screen reader users to get their feedback. And that was the first one I talked about, which was just pretty much just plain HTML at that point. And then the last one where we brought it all together with the visual sort of styled version as well. But the Figma prototype was only ever going to be feasible for doing usability testing with low vision users, which is why we definitely wanted to make sure that we still had an HTML prototype separately as well.
Brilliant, thank you. And also, Jonny, on the testing point, I'm interested to know how you recruited for user testing and how many users were involved.
Great question. So the advantage of working with a charity like RNIB is that obviously you have quite a lot of access to people who have visual impairments of some kind through mailing lists, through existing relationships with people that they serve. So we benefited from that, being able to draw people that way, and we were able to build up a panel of volunteers who were happy to take part in that research. But we did need to supplement that, and that's when, because we often needed some quite specific conditions, or people who use this specific assistive technology, say that 5 times fast. We did also supplement that with recruitment via a participant recruitment agency. We have one in particular that we partner with who have a roster of people that you can see what their different characteristics, their different conditions, different assistive tech, and pick out exactly what you need in order to investigate the questions that you have. And so for wherever there are gaps, we were able to draw upon that as well.
Thank you very much, Jonny. And we have a question from Mike about what are your thoughts on using text on images, so particularly for paid marketing, and how do you then make them as accessible as possible? Ben or Quarina?
Quarina, do you want? I can go if you like. Yeah. Sorry. Text on images, I would say generally tend to avoid them because obviously it can make text harder to read. I mean, there's a number of different ways you can try to increase contrast by adding shadows, backgrounds, or just choosing images that have like very even, unbroken backgrounds. But we've personally found it's quite hard to make that a sustainable approach when you're actually trying to sort of refresh images and use different images and continually find images that work with that. So I personally tend to try and avoid it.
Yeah, well, in paid marketing, it's a little, and social media is a little more unavoidable. And I think what we say is our advice is if it's any sort of text that cannot be read, i.e. is text on image and as a JPEG, make sure you write it out as well. And it can be as simple as just saying text on image reads this as part of your caption at the bottom.
And somebody else asked about social media as well. Does WCAG 2.2 apply to social media? Or is it just that you kind of follow the same kind of rules for your posts on social?
Oh, sorry, Quarina, go on.
There are definitely, I guess, tips and tricks on how to make your social media much more accessible. Our social media team does an amazing job of actually calling out companies that aren't really necessarily doing the best that they can. One of my current favorite is we provided audio description for the Calvin Klein ads, because why shouldn't blind and partially sighted people enjoy that type of content too? And we can send around a resource that kind of says how, like, you know, tips, a little kind of helping guide on how to make social media accessible. But biggest one is for me alt text describing what's on the images and hashtags, and make sure that you sentence case your hashtags. Otherwise, it leads to very awkward readings of certain hashtags. Sorry, Jane, I interrupted you.
No, sorry, I didn't realize you were in full flow. I was just going to add to that about from a technical perspective, WCAG 2.2, in theory, it's mostly around how things are built rather than content specific. So essentially, treat it as you would with the 2.1 guidelines as well. Go for your standard best practices because nothing significant applies really.
Thank you. And we have a couple of questions in relations to tools. Somebody asked, what are your thoughts on accessibility tools such as Recite Me? Is it the case that if you need to add these, your website is failing on accessibility?
Yeah, great question. And very simple answer is avoid them at all costs because they're really bad practice. Really, they're like a plaster on a underlying issue. You're not addressing the core accessibility issue. So if you're adding them, you may not even be aware of the accessibility issues on your site. But yeah, they're very expensive, potentially, and also can actually add more issues to your site rather than solve them. So yeah, avoid them at all costs and try and get to the core of the problems.
I would just add that if you do want to kind of see what your website might sound like on a screen reader, sometimes it is just as simple as just saying, the read aloud function that most browsers have. Honestly, something as simple as that really provides a lot of insight as to how your content will be read, particularly, you don't necessarily need to implement, Recite Me or any other tools like that.
And in terms of if people want to audit their site and see how they're performing in terms of accessibility, but they don't necessarily want to use the support of an agency, what can they do themselves?
There are some really great resources out there in terms of guidelines around how to test using automated accessibility tools. So there are some plugins you can add to your browser, which can be really quick to set up and really easy just to flag some really easy quick fixes that you can make. But otherwise, it would be a case of doing some more manual testing with screen readers. So you can, look up some if you're interested, look up some tutorials on how to start a VoiceOver, for instance, on Mac. But we also have some internal resources that we can share on this. So yeah, we will follow up with those afterwards.
Brilliant, thank you. We're out of time, actually, just about. So I just wanted to say thank you very much to all of our speakers and to all the hard work you put into the information that you've shared today. And thank you very much to everybody for coming. And I will share a follow-up email after with all the links and the recording. And I don't know if you've seen it, Quarina, but there's some lovely shout outs to the social media team about the Calvin Klein post on Twitter as well, which was absolutely brilliant. So yeah, thank you. Hope to see you all at another event very soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.